The moon was huge tonight, painting the low clouds and patches of land below a dull grey. Major William Stratton and Master Sergeant Hans Hogland were flying a lazy, curving course at 14,000 feet when Hogland saw a fuzzy contact on his scope. Heading 330 degrees, speed 320 knots, range 7 miles. It faded out for a moment and then reappeared. They accelerated, pushing the J-34s to the stops, now closing fast. As they passed 2,000 feet, Stratton tried to acquire the target on their gun-aiming radar, but the system wouldn't lock on. Making a split-second decision, he decided to engage visually. A dark speck appeared in the windshield directly ahead of them. Stratton fired his first burst from 1,200 feet. 4 20mm cannons each fired 10 explosive shells a second. Impacts dotted the target's port wing. He fired a second burst, hitting the fuselage, then a third, right up the tailpipe. There was a large explosion and the communist fighter ended a steep dive, trailing fire. Stratton and Hogland lost sight of it as it entered the low clouds at 6,000 feet. The weather at midnight on December the 30th, 1967 was atrocious. Driving rain, zero visibility. Lieutenant Bill Loggerman and Major Ken Ingraham were flying the DMZ patrol that night when Air Force GCI came on the radio. There was a bogey out there in the murk, moving south at speed. Loggerman turned the big Skyknight as it churned through air thick with rain. Ingraham worked the scope, trying to see what the Air Force could see. The cockpit was quiet. If they were lucky, there was nothing out there, just a weather-made glitch in some system somewhere. If they were unlucky, then it was a MiG-17. The Skyknight's dogfighting days were over, but it did retain 2 20mm cannons with which to defend itself. But if they were really unlucky, then the incoming aircraft was a MiG-21. At least it would be quick. But their luck held. After an hour of frustrating searching, the contact faded out. Willy the Whale was denied one last chance at an air-to-air kill. The Skyknight's remarkable journey began in April 1945, when the US Navy put out a tender for a radar-equipped night fighter. This aircraft was to be a side-by-side two-seater with a range of 350 miles and ability to attack both air and ground targets. It was to be capable of over 500 miles per hour at 40,000 feet and have the ability to climb at least 3,500 feet per minute. It was intended to detect an enemy bomber from 125 miles away. This was a real stretch for the electronics technology of the day and would require a very large antenna for a fighter aircraft. Although no such aircraft existed at this time, the Navy anticipated that by the end of the decade, jet bombers would be in service in the USSR. The specification was generally thought to be impossible to fulfill, although it didn't stop a dozen companies participating in the competition. 4 of these were then down-selected to provide a prototype: Douglas, Grumman, Curtiss, and Fleetwings. Of these, Douglas and Grumman were contracted for prototypes and static test articles. The Douglas proposal was seen as the preferred option, with Grumman's jet-powered Tigercat derivative the reserve, which is just as well as Grumman's project floundered within months of the competition award in late 1945. In one of those twists of fate, though, they negotiated with the Navy to use the money on a single-seat fighter study they'd been working on, ultimately resulting in the Panther and its descendants. Over at Douglas, work proceeded at a pace. Ed Heinemann and his team at El Segundo put together a relatively conventional design. XFD-3 was a mid-engined monoplane with 2 3,000-pound force J-34s in semi-recessed nacelles beneath the fuselage center section. The nozzles pointed slightly down, which was to prove an issue. The tail group was conventional, being similar to that of the Sky Raider. Fuel cells were located above the engines in the center fuselage. Tricycle landing gear was fitted, with the main gear retracting into the inner wing panels. It was a dumpy, massive aircraft for the time, principally because the Skyknight was the first Navy fighter to be designed around its avionics, in this case the mighty ANAPQ-35 radar system. ANAPQ-35 actually consisted of two radars. The ANAPS-21 search radar could locate fighter-sized targets at a range of 20 miles. It was a 250 kilowatt set that used a giant 30-inch dish. To give you a point of comparison, the ANAPG-36 in the contemporary Sabre Dog used an 18-inch dish. Although things are rarely this simple in early radar, the Skyknight could effectively put 3 times as much power in the air, leading to a detection range about 1.5 to 2 times that of the Sabre Dog. The big search radar was paired with an ANAPS-26 targeting radar with a range of 2 miles. The ANAPS-21 was used to locate a target, which was then passed over to the ANAPS-26 at close range for target tracking. The big radar and its operator were then free to continue to scan for new targets as there were 2 complete dishes and computer systems in the aircraft. The APQ-35 was therefore one of the first track-while-scan radar systems ever developed. Incorporating over 300 thermionic valves, reliability was not the best, but that was true for all complicated avionics systems of the era. It was also a heavy system, weighing 650 pounds when the later tail warning radar was added. That doesn't factor in the heavy power supplies needed for the radar, navigational, radio, air conditioning systems, and so on. Overall, it all contributed to an aircraft with a lot of drag, empty weight greater than the loaded combat weight of most single-seat fighters, and not a lot of power. It did, however, allow for a side-by-side seating arrangement, which led to one of the eventual Skyknight's more unique design features, namely the crew escape system. It was already accepted that bailing out of a jet fighter in the conventional manner didn't work well. Most people who mattered were already zeroing in on the upwards firing rocket-propelled ejector seat as the most workable escape method. Now, conventional ejection seats would have worked from a safety point of view. The issue the designers faced was that the Skyknight's weight problem was now out of control. A pair of ejection seats weighed between 250 and 300 pounds. Omitting them seemed like a good option. The Douglas engineers' solution was to install an escape slide. To use it, one of the crew pulled a lever that jettisoned the aft section of the escape door, leaving the forward portion to act as a windbreak. The crew would then pivot in their seats, grab hold of the vaulting bar above the chute, and exit feet first out of the bottom of the plane. After leaving, the airmen had to wait 5 seconds before pulling the ripcord. Supposedly, this system was extensively tested and proven to be safe, but I've seen no documentation to that effect. Completing the aircraft was the standard 1940s Navy armament of 4 M3 20mm cannons. F3D-1's maiden flight was made on the 23rd of March 1948 at El Segundo with Russell Thor as the pilot. It was an uneventful flight as the XF-3D was very conventional aerodynamically. Testing continued until October when the 3 prototypes were transferred to Edwards for government trials. During this time, the aircraft were also tested by the USAF, but its contemplated procurement failed to materialize. However, the production future of the aircraft had already been assured as 28 F3D-1 Skyknights had been ordered for delivery to the Navy and Marine Corps. The total value was $50 million, making each aircraft worth a smidge under $1.8 million. The Air Force was paying about $280,000 for a Sabre at this point, and $1.1 million for the basically comparable F-89B Scorpion Interceptor. Skyknights were expensive aircraft. Production examples received a slightly enhanced J-34 with 3,250 pounds of thrust. That's 6,500 in total, and still not a lot for an aircraft that weighed over 17,000 pounds empty in this version. Production models had some other minor avionics changes and a fiberglass rather than a metal nose cone. While production ramped up, carrier suitability tests got going in March of 1949. They went poorly. The XF3D was obviously significantly underpowered, but it wasn't unusual in early jets from that point of view. Being a relatively large aircraft, it had relatively large wings with 400 square feet of area, but with its large weight, the catapult could only accelerate it so much. Test pilots found that they were always struggling to get the nose at the right attitude for the plane to fly. There were problems behind the ship as well. The large nose and low seating position made it difficult for the pilot to correctly position the aircraft. You can see in this picture how the pilot is having to stretch to see sufficiently far down past the nose. Of all the issues, this was the worst. It made landing in daytime quite challenging, and the Skyknight was an all-weather fighter. The Navy quickly concluded that the F3D-1 could only safely operate from a land base. Their hope was that by increasing engine power, they would be able to take the marginal Dash 1 and turn it into a true carrier fighter. The letter of intent for this more powerful version was issued in October 1949. The intention was to fit the Dash 2 with the new Westinghouse J-26, each offering up to 4,600 pounds of thrust. 40% more would really change the lumbering Skyknight. But Westinghouse were in a bit of a low point at this time, unfortunately. The Dash 2 was redesigned with larger nacelles to accommodate the larger diameter engine, but it never appeared. Instead, the upgraded F3D-2 flew with an updated J34 offering 3,600 pounds of thrust and retained it throughout its service life. The other major upgrade to the F3D at this point was to add a tail warning radar, able to detect an enemy fighter from 10 miles. This would prove a real lifesaver in Korea. An autopilot was fitted for the first time to reduce pilot workload, cabin air conditioning was improved, alongside bulletproofing for the windscreen and a few small changes elsewhere. The Dash 2 was the definitive night fighter version of the Skyknight. It was a big old bird for the day. Empty weight was 18,160 pounds, which is nearly twice that of the Grumman Panther day fighter. Loaded with fuel and weapons, it tipped the scale at 23,500 pounds. 45 feet long with a 50-foot wingspan, it was quite large in terms of the area it required in the hangar or on the deck. The top of the tailplane was 16 feet high. On the few times it deployed on carriers, it was not highly regarded in terms of its deck handling characteristics. Maximum speed was 565 miles per hour. It cruised at 390 and had a maximum combat radius of about 500 miles. These aren't outstanding numbers, but naval fighters of the late 1940s were not 600 mile per hour aircraft. Meeting the original specifications, climb rate was 4,000 feet per minute, and it could reach 38,200 feet. 237 Dash 2s were produced, with production ending in March 1952. At about the same time production was ending, Marine All-Weather Fighter Squadron 542 left El Toro for Korea. The 542nd had previously flown the F-7F Tiger Cat in that theatre and had spent nearly a year converting to the new F-3D. They took 12 aircraft over in May and June 1952, moving to K-8 Air Base near Kunsan almost immediately on arrival. There they joined the Flying Nightmares of VMFN 513. Their Dash 2 Skyknights were painted flat black. High visibility white stencils were replaced with dull red. Anything to reduce the enemy's ability to detect them. Issues with the availability of the gun barrel extension kits required to fire the Skyknight's cannons delayed the start of combat operations until August 1952. They found that the Korean nights were lively and terrifying. Skyknights, Tiger Cats, and Air Force Starfires were vectored onto targets by the GCI site on Chodo Island, variously call-signed Dentist, Dutch Boy, Kodak, and Mongoose. Powerful though it was, the radar on Chodo was very crude by today's standards. Its controls and screens were a development of pre-war British systems. Locating a target and plotting its bearing required a great deal of skill and a little luck. Then the operator had to vector an interceptor onto the right track, keeping track of both the bogey and the interceptor. This was not an easy task, and interviews with Skyknight pilots demonstrate how most of the time they were sent to targets that didn't exist, or would encounter their own targets undetected by Dentist. All of this was compounded by the enemy, who weren't just going to go and lie down and get shot down. Although they lacked night fighters of their own, the Communists deployed their LA-11, Yak-9, and MiG-15 fighters at night. Their pilots would be directed by GCI and then attempt to locate the UN aircraft from their exhaust flames. The Skyknight's tail radar provided significant warning against this kind of attack. As the war ground on, Communist aviators learned to dive below Chodo radar and escape the Skyknights in the ground clutter. The MiG-15's vastly superior speed and maneuverability enabled it to escape the ponderous Skyknights and attempt to re-engage. Fortunately for the Nightmares, lack of avionic sophistication made it almost impossible for a MiG-15 pilot to engage a fighter-sized target at night. More dangerous were the traps set by the Communists. These typically consisted of a lone MiG as bait. When the UN fighters went after it, they were illuminated by radar-directed searchlights and engaged by flak batteries firing at predetermined heights. One of these traps may have killed the CO of the Flying Nightmares, Colonel Peter Lambrecht, and his radar officer shortly before midnight on August the 15th. No trace of his aircraft has ever been found on a night on which others encountered such ambushes. The Tactical Directions Center reported that having reached his station, the aircraft's IFF beacon suddenly dimmed and then disappeared. A ground observer reported seeing an unidentified aircraft crash into the sea at around the same time. A search in the very early hours of August the 16th detected a red signal flare, but it was quickly extinguished. The loss remains a mystery, but can perhaps be explained by the loss of another Skyknight. In this case, on the 1st of September, a Skyknight suffered 2 engine explosions in quick succession that resulted in the aircraft plummeting towards the sea. Although unable to use the escape chute at low level, the radar operator miraculously survived and was rescued by a crash boat. His report tallied with other incidents of J-34 failures in the US and led to Korean Skyknights being grounded for 2 months while armor was placed around the engine to prevent thrown blades in the third turbine section causing catastrophic damage to the rest of the aircraft. When missions resumed in the middle of October, the Marines' primary mission was to escort B-29s on their nightly raids over the north. The escort mission was not as simple as hanging out near the bomber stream. Typically, 2 Skyknights would do this, orbiting until the bombers arrived from Japan and then escorting them to the target. 2 others would go north, putting themselves between the Chinese MiG bases and the bomber stream as a bar cap. At least 1, often 2 Skyknights would orbit the target itself, lying in wait for any MiGs that made it past the bar cap and were trying to ambush the bombers. Although their efforts were significant, no defense is perfect. On the night of the 18th of November 1952, the B-29 Wright's Delights was shot down by MiGs after dropping its bombs near a target at Songhon, North Korea. 12 of the 14 crew were killed. By the time of the shoot-down, the Skyknights had scored themselves. Stratton and Hoglin's encounter on the 3rd was initially chalked up as a Yak-15, but it was later confirmed to be a MiG-15 of the 147th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, flown by a Captain Vishniak. He apparently survived, but it is unclear what happened to his MiG. In the early hours of November the 8th, Captain Oliver Davis and radar operator Ding Fessler scored a definite kill. Vectored onto a contact by Dutch Boy, they bagged a MiG-15 from the 351st Night Fighter Aviation Regiment, which they were able to track via its exhaust flame, a reversal of the method that the MiGs used to find B-29s. In general, finding and catching any aircraft at night in an early 50s fighter was extremely challenging. This was even more the case with the infamous PO-2 night hecklers that the Communists employed to irritate the UN forces. The PO-2 made the Skyknight look like an SR-71. An ancient biplane first flown in 1927, the PO-2 could carry only a limited payload and cruised at 80 knots. That slow speed, however, enabled it to fly at extremely low altitude. Furthermore, its engines didn't emit the telltale flames of supercharged piston engines. The Skyknight's sole confirmed kill against the Night Hecklers was therefore executed solely using the APG-26 radar on December the 10th. It was not, however, a PO-2 that was shot down. The PO-2 was constructed of wood and fabric and therefore generated sporadic radar returns, mainly off the engine block. Finding one on a dark night in a jet or fast piston engine fighter was a matter of luck more than skill. The victim on the 10th was almost certainly an all-metal Yak-18 monoplane trainer that the communists pressed into service as a light bomber. Getting a radar return from this was much easier, somewhat negating the challenging closing speed and zero visibility. Sometimes technology works against you. But the Skyknight's main opponent was the MiG-15. Every night they went aloft to play the game of cat and mouse. Most often, success for the US side was the safety of bombers. The communists wanted to deny that safety. Neither side necessarily needed to kill the other, albeit the determination of B-29 crews to press their attacks and their general unwillingness to turn away meant that the MiG pilots and their supporting flak batteries were more likely to need to destroy a bomber to accomplish their mission. Although fighter pilot professionalism meant that the Skyknight pilot wanted to kill the MiG pilots and vice versa, success in this endeavour was in fact secondary to the mission, and both sets of pilots were extraordinarily skilled and brave, being no doubt that theirs was one of the most dangerous assignments of the war. The Marines were operating in enemy territory in the dead of night with little support and no chance of rescue until daybreak, if they survived the escape chute. The MiG pilots flew alone, without radar and with only patchy contact with their ground controllers. Death from an unseen, radar-equipped American could come at any moment. 3 more MiG-15s were downed by Skyknights in January 1953 at the cost of a B-29 destroyed near Pyongyang and several 23mm shell holes in a Skyknight that narrowly avoided being downed by a MiG. The nocturnal battle changed shape after January. Now aware that there was a new and capable night fighter in the theatre, the Communist air forces reduced their focus on the B-29s and instead started targeting the Skyknights. Although this increased the jeopardy for those crews, it also meant that no B-29s were lost on night raids for the remainder of the war. 2 more Skyknights did go down, though, both in May 1953. One was a prosaic landing accident. The other remains unexplained, but appears to be some kind of in-flight mishap on the approach to Kunsan. You'll have noticed that despite the Skyknight being designed as a carrier fighter, I've not yet mentioned the Navy. Carrier-based F3Ds did in fact deploy to the theatre. A night fighter detachment from VC-4, a composite squadron known as the Nightcappers, sent 4 aircraft onto the Lake Champlain in early June 1953. The Skyknight proved to be a pain to operate and pretty unpopular with everyone from carrier air group commander to deck crew. It was large and hard to move around the deck. Those downward canted jet nozzles heated the deck around the catapult so much that there had to be a pause in operations after an F3D was launched in order to let it cool. Occasionally, it would even set fire to the deck. Using the catapult was fraught with danger. These weren't steam catapults. They were the finicky H8 hydraulic system. Dialed to maximum, it could just about deliver enough urge to launch the big Skyknight. The problem was that hydraulic catapults had a tendency to shoot cold, risking dumping the aircraft into the sea. And because it was turned up to maximum, the catapult shuttle also managed to break the Skyknight's catapult bridle twice during the cruise, sending the heavy shuttle hurtling to the end of the track at high speed. The resulting damage put the system out of commission until repairs could be accomplished. There wasn't really any upside to the carrier crew to operating the F3D. The aircraft had only one mission. It was too big and too slow to be effective in any day role, and in any case it couldn't carry bombs or rockets. The Nightcappers were unceremoniously sent to shore. Their deployment was rather unsuccessful. 2 Skyknights were lost, at least one of them to a MiG, in exchange for a MiG apparently set on fire, the fate of which was unconfirmed. The Skyknight therefore ended the war having downed 6 aircraft for 1 or 2 losses and a further 4 aircraft destroyed in operational accidents. On the face of it, hardly a storming success. What has to be factored in, though, is the number of B-29 crews that lived to tell the tale because of the presence of Skyknights. The Korean experience was also very valuable in learning about the practical use of an all-weather jet fighter. The F3D was built around its radar, accepting many dynamic compromises as a result. Although powerful, using the tuning, controls, and interface of that system was an art, and one that limited the effectiveness of the Skyknight as a weapon system. For all of its claimed 125-mile range, in reality the Skyknight crews picked up MiGs at around 10 miles. The MiG-15 is a small target, but even so, the real performance of the APQ-35 was disappointing. And because of the dynamic compromises, a MiG could easily escape from the Skyknight by either going fast or high. If it got past the combat air patrol, then it would have a free run at any bombers being escorted or the carrier itself. This was less of an issue for faster fighters. Willy the Whale was totally dependent on its situational awareness. On the upside, the tail warning radar was a real success, although it too meant taking a weight penalty. As radar ranging gun sights became the norm, these heavy active systems became less required. A simple radar warning receiver would suffice. The Skyknight was basically obsolete on delivery. The Navy had already concluded that they were not a viable option for a carrier all-weather aircraft. Something with more performance and thus more flexibility of role was needed in the increasingly space-constrained hangar deck. They therefore hurried through production of a super-sized, radar-equipped version of the McDonnell Banshee and pushed ahead with the follow-on Demon. Partly in an attempt to improve the Skyknight's effectiveness, but mainly to test the missiles, a dozen F3D-1s and 16-2s were modified to carry the experimental Sparrow 1 radar-guided missile. The -2Ms were quite a significant rebuild, having their guns deleted and the APQ-36 radar fitted in an extended nose cone. These apparently were service fighters rather than purely prototypes. VX-4 took them aboard the Hancock for a brief deployment, as you can see in this photo. Their service life was, however, extremely short. It wasn't viable as a carrier-based fighter, and the Marines had no real use for it in their limited budget. But just as it was about to be sent to the scrap heap, the Skyknight's size led to an unlikely reprieve. Korea had further demonstrated the importance of electronic warfare capabilities in modern warfighting. The cat-and-mouse game played by the Skyknights, MiGs, B-29s and ground-based defences was obviously a precursor of the electronic battlefield of the 50s and 60s. With a period of peace in sight, collecting information on the electronic order of battle was essential to US planners, and if the balloon did go up, threat location and jamming would be essential parts of the force mix. 35 Skyknights were therefore stripped of their radars and outfitted with an APR-13 panoramic surveillance receiver, an APA-69 direction finder, and an ALA-3 pulse analyzer. The nose bay played host to two 200-watt noise jammers, chaff pods, and 300-gallon fuel tanks could be carried under the wings. 2 of the 20mm cannons and their ammunition cans were retained. The other 2 were removed to make more space. These aircraft went all over the world over the next decade. They flew down the east coast of the Soviet Union, profiling radars, snooped on China, monitored the buildup of Soviet air defenses in Cuba as the US considered whether to invade. 3 Marine squadrons flew the F3D-2Q, which was redesignated EF-10B in 1962. By the time 1964 came around, these were amongst the most skilled electronic reconnaissance professionals in the world, particularly when it came to finding the SA-2 guideline and associated ground control apparatus. Fan song, bar lock, spoon rest, knife rest, fire can and their like were the Marine Elite Squadron's stock in trade. Their expertise was about to put them and Willy the Whale back in harm's way. The increasing threat of Soviet-made SAMs and anti-aircraft artillery resulted in 6 EF-10Bs being deployed to Da Nang in April 1965. Initially, they focused on trying to spot North Vietnamese radars and GCI communications from within southern airspace. But by the end of the month, they were actively attempting to jam VPAF GCI in the first active ECM missions of the war. In support of this, the Skyknight, recently upgraded with an ALR-8 surveillance receiver, now hung heavy ALQ-31 jamming pods under their wings, specifically designed to jam the various radars in the integrated air defense system. Their efforts were so successful in protecting strikes that the venerable Skyknights were called upon to fly double or even triple their normal maximum sortie rate. By this point, of course, the EF-10 was ancient history. The aircrews were therefore either veterans who'd suffered the old plane's foibles for a decade, or they were fresh recruits. The latter had likely expected to be phantom Rios and pilots, but instead found themselves as ECMOs or whale drivers. Such was the antiquity of the EF-10s that there were no manuals for the converted aircraft. In fact, many of the switches and buttons in the cockpit had functions lost to history. Learning the aircraft was therefore a process of trial and error. Occasionally, in frustration at a developing fault, a crewman would hit a button in exasperation only to find that it cured his issues. These nuggets were passed on in the ready room. Skyknight airframes were not much better. They had not been designed for 15 years of service and were considered structurally unsound. A 1G limit was therefore in place for any manoeuvres. And this is an aircraft expected to tussle with SAMs and flak, remember. It is little surprise, given the doddery aircraft, that the first loss of an EF-10 involved an unknown malfunction, its crew vanishing without trace into the Gulf of Tonkin on the 31st of July 1965. Early in the war, the Skyknight's detection equipment and jammers were able to somewhat counter the threat from the still developing North Vietnamese air defense network, but the nature of its mission was very demanding for the old aircraft. To be effective, they needed to be on station in advance of the strikers and hang around until after they had left. Since they couldn't refuel in flight, the Whale had to carry at least one of the large 300-gallon drop tanks under the wings as well as the jamming pod. This made taking off something of an adventure. Takeoff rolls went way up from the normal 5,000 feet to more like 7,000 or 8,000, and even then the climb rate on departure was painfully slow. And yet the Marine crews soldiered on. They also flew their missions unescorted because no one could spare any aircraft. This is despite the Skyknight being effectively defenseless against a MiG. On one early mission, an EF-10B crew received warning that a MiG was approaching them from the rear at 14 miles distance. Turning away to flee, the pilot flipped the arming switch for the 20mm cannons and fired a burst to test them. Both jammed within 5 rounds. Since the EF-10 was not expected to ever use its weapons again, maintenance had been neglected. Later inspection found that none of the squadron's cannons were in working order. Fortunately, in this case, the crew managed to escape at low level. From August 1965, EF-10s received escort from Marine Phantoms. In the interim, the squadron had contacted a Marine Crusader squadron operating out in the Gulf. If they had fuel remaining after their own missions, they would come and loiter with the Whales until they had to return to base. Marine aviation was a small community, and they stuck together. When the EF-10B arrived in Vietnam, the air defense threat was significant but containable. They could go up, find the right radars to jam, and degrade their capabilities. But by the fall of 1965, the threat level had exploded. There were 3 times as many radars and systems out there, and the primitive Whale simply didn't have the electronic sophistication to sift through them and find the right threat to go after. Dropping chaff provided a simple, short-duration distraction that could work in some situations. The Whale's ability to detect SAM launches and alert Air Force crews who lacked radar warning receivers at this point, was also valuable. But a new ECM platform was desperately needed. The Navy and Marines had such a thing in development, the EA-6A electric intruder, but it was significantly delayed. So the Skyknight soldiered on, its decrepit airframe being further worn out by the harsh weather and punishing schedule. In the spring of 1966, the SAMs finally caught up with the Marines. Supporting an F-105 strike near Tranho, Riverboat 2 with pilot Lieutenant Everett McPherson and ECMO Lieutenant Brent Davis was hit by an SA-2 guideline fired by the 61st Battalion of the 236th Missile Regiment. When the wreckage was finally located in 1997, McPherson's remains were not aboard, suggesting that he had flown the aircraft for some time before attempting to use the escape chute at low level. His body has yet to be found. After this loss, the Whales were forbidden to go within 20 miles of potential SA-2 sites, essentially limiting them to overwater operations in the Gulf of Tonkin. Fortunately, this coincided with Air Force EB-66Cs arriving in theatre to take over from the EF-10s, which now supported Navy operations alongside EA-6As, which finally arrived at the end of October 1966. But such were their teething problems that nearly a year later, in August 1967, the decision was taken to upgrade the Skyknights, adding broadband threat and missile launch warning receivers and improved displays for the ECMO. The latter finally moved the cockpit process on from one in which the ECMO had to manually use dials to tune in on emitters to a more modern automated process. With more displays on hand, they could also monitor search and fire control spectrums at once. The updated Super Whales arrived on the flight line at Da Nang at the end of February 1968, days before Rolling Thunder was brought to a close. As strikes continued until November of 1968, the Skyknights remained busy though, albeit primarily in a passive ECM role along the DMZ. As missions continued, it became increasingly clear that one of the upgrades made in the Super Whale would accelerate the end of its long and busy career. A small conical dome had been installed under the aft fuselage, housing a steerable ECM antenna. Although this was rarely used in practice, it was pointed out by the crews that it would be hazardous in the event of a need to escape the aircraft. It should be said that the escape chute was not effective in general, at least not in a combat zone. In 5 losses in Vietnam and 6 in Korea, the chute saved 0 lives. Even so, it had been used successfully stateside, and it remained the only crew egress option. Training and stateside experience said that rather than falling free of the aircraft immediately, crewmen instead bumped along the bottom of the fuselage in the airflow before falling clear. In the Super Whale, that would mean being thrown back into the ECM antenna with obvious negative results for aviator health. Tests were conducted back in the US, which apparently validated the concern sufficiently that the Skyknight was abruptly withdrawn from Vietnam in October 1969. For the record, September 1969 was the first month that the EA-6A flew more sorties than the EF-10B. With the electric intruder's bugs being ironed out and the vastly more sophisticated EA-6B Prowler on the horizon, the Skyknight was unceremoniously retired at the end of May 1970. Raytheon kept flying 2 examples into the 1980s as electronic testbeds. That large capacity continued to be useful. Little remembered today, the Skyknight was, in fact, an aircraft that laid down more route markers in the development of naval aviation than most. For starters, it was the last straight-wing jet fighter flying in active US service. It outlived both the Big Banjo that replaced it as a night fighter and the generation of swept-wing fighters that came after it. It was the first naval fighter designed around its avionics, and the aerodynamic compromises that came with that packaging were what enabled it to be retasked as the first jet-powered Elint aircraft. You could argue that it was not until the F-35 that another Navy or Marine fighter was designed with so little regard for dynamic performance. I'll probably get some comments on that statement, so I might leave it there. Back on the Skyknight, very few aircraft played such an active part in both Korea and Vietnam. I think only the Sky Raider and B-26 Invader are the other members of that club. But despite this, the Skyknight doesn't have much fame, likely because it was on the edge of the force mix as far as the average enthusiast is concerned. Or perhaps just because it doesn't look like a fighter plane. You need to be fast and have swept wings to be a 1950s MiG killer, don't you? Not if they can't see you. You need to lug massive bomb loads supersonic on the deck to be a 1960s strike aircraft, of course. Not if your weapon is radio waves and success is preventing the other guy shooting first. In this way, the Skyknight was a pioneer. Throughout its career, it fought the battle for that first shot. Because of the technology limitations of the time, it was not a universal success. It was not, in fact, a great aircraft in any real respect. The aviators that flew it had the skill and the persistence to work around its many issues to turn it into an effective and, at times, a vital part of the force mix. If only it had looked more like a fighter.